Hello everybody and welcome back to my sunroom. I'm coming up on the 19th anniversary of buying my very first orchid. And as I look around at all of my orchids, I'm amazed that something that started almost 20 years ago became such a driving force in my life and such an awesome hobby that I've been able to share with you all. I thought you all might like to hear about how I got started with my orchids and my thoughts on growing orchids as a hobby. I bought my very first orchid in February 2002. I was in a grocery store and it had been a long, gray, cold winter here in East Tennessee. And a friend of mine who was a floral manager was holding this plant with purple flowers, and I couldn't believe it. It was the very first orchid that I had ever seen for sale in my area. The winter had been very cold here, and this was a gorgeous plant blooming in February. To me, it was just too good to be true. I didn't know anything about this plant, but I was about to learn. My sweet friend gave me some tips that she had learned from another customer who grew them. Rule number one being, don't let it sit in water or it will die. I just couldn't believe that I was going to buy an orchid because they were that rare to find in my area at that time. The thrill of that orchid find, that adrenaline rush that you get, it hit me that day. So I brought little purple orchid home, and it had 3 leaves and 3 little purple blooms. I was afraid to touch it. I was afraid to take it out of its pot, and when I watered it, I made sure I drained it really well. I placed it in my rather dark entryway because that's where I place my favorite things. Also, the tag said low light, and I thought that meant very little light. I did learn it was a phalaenopsis, and I bought a very general gardening book about orchids. I still have that book. It's just a memory. So I didn't give it enough light. I didn't know how often to water it, and so the roots rotted, and that was that. It lived about 6 months. But the grocery store where I bought it got some more orchids in that spring. So I bought some more and I made some more mistakes on those, but they lived longer this time. Some of them even rebloomed the next year. I had learned to give them morning sunlight and I got better at watering them. So I went to the library and I checked out all of the 2 books that they had on orchids, and I pretty much memorized them. I figured out the hard way that you really have to watch somebody repot an orchid to learn how to do so successfully. It absolutely terrified me to repot when I first started growing orchids. One reason is the bark that I found 15 or 20 years ago was just awful. And there was no Amazon to find the quality bark that you can find today. So I would repot and my orchids would unfortunately die. And I'm really so grateful that quality bark, moss, and supplies are so easy to find now. The very first success story I had with an orchid was with my Cattleya. I bought this one in 2003 and it was in moss. And it was growing in an orchid quality moss. So it was so easy to care for and it did so well. Luckily, I found orchid moss from an expensive plant store here in my area. And that's when I learned to use quality medium with my orchids. My Cattleya has thrived ever since I bought it. And that's the reason I'm so eager to share my orchid experiences with you all. I learned to grow orchids by growing orchids. There were some friends along the way that gave me really valuable advice, And I appreciated them sharing that with me, or I wouldn't have had success with orchids. Some of the best advice I ever got when I first started growing was, don't worry about them, just talk to them. And that's one of the ways I chose my channel name. And another good piece of advice, don't mess with them unless you have to. Yes, that's excellent advice that I remind myself about pretty often. I was determined to learn how to grow orchids. So I told myself 20 years ago that I would learn how to do this. A positive outlook on growing orchids is really important because your skills will improve and you grow with them. Just make up your mind you're going to learn to grow them and be successful. It is very much a learning process, and everyone is at some point in that process. I am still in that learning process. There's so much information to be learned. Just don't be overwhelmed by it. You can watch me and you can watch other people grow their orchids. Just know that people grow their orchids different ways. There's not just one way to do it. You have to learn how to grow orchids in your environment, and your environment is going to be different than other people's. There are ironclad rules, and then there's this artistry that we learn with experience. And experience is the best teacher. When I first started growing orchids, I went by a set of rules because that's all I had to go by. There was no YouTube when I started growing orchids, so I had to read books. And those books were written by people who grew in a different climate than mine. So I had to learn to adapt certain things to my environment. And just remember, your growing area is going to be at least slightly different than anyone else's. If you start out with an orchid like I did, when I first started growing, that just doesn't flourish, maybe because it was mishandled before you even bought it, or you're not skilled enough to know how to care for it correctly yet, or maybe it's just not the strongest plant. Don't be discouraged by that. Take that experience and put it towards growing your next plant. That's what I did. I started out with one plant because that was all they had at the grocery store that day. There weren't any other choices. So I took the skill that I learned from my first orchid and I put it into the next one. Then I took the mistakes and the skill that I learned from that plant and I put it into the next plant. And as I gained skill, my orchids lived longer, they stayed healthier longer, and the first time one actually rebloomed for me, it was just magical. So if you've grown orchids for a few years and you've had one to rebloom for you, then you're doing very well. Say a hallelujah and do a happy dance. You can't expect, though, to just learn everything overnight, is what I'm saying. I studied very hard for the first few years I had orchids. I still study quite a bit. And it's that study time that helps you to build your growing muscles. Growing orchids is an endless learning experience. So from my experience, here are some suggestions and philosophies about growing orchids that I hold on to that I hope help you. Pick out a really healthy plant. When you start out with a healthy plant, it makes life easier on you. The next thing, grow it in the right light and in the right amount of light, in the right location. The next thing, use good quality water. Reverse osmosis water or rainwater is the best in my opinion. Keep a good fertilizer schedule that incorporates the right nutrients. And learn to repot. Watch good repotting videos. I have some on my channel. I'll place them in the description box below. I hope those really help you all. But before you repot, watch a repotting. Be ready. The next is be consistent and persistent with your care. The next is keep an eye on your orchids so that you can head off any problems right when they begin. The next one is speak life over your orchids, speak life over yourself and your family. They will respond, that's for sure. And the ironclad rule that I go by, I do have one that's ironclad. Enjoy your orchids. They know when they're loved. So I'm going to end my Orchid Philosophy 101 class right here. This is Phal Legato. She's been in my collection for 14 years and she is my oldest Phalaenopsis. So now I'd like to hear from you all. How long have you all been growing orchids? And what was your first orchid? Do you still have that same orchid? And how long did you grow before you had success with an orchid? I can't wait to hear your story. And as always, thank you so much for watching and for going on my journey with orchids with me. And it is a journey, isn't it? It's a fun journey. And you all are such a blessing to me. I appreciate your all's friendship so much. I'd love to say the blessing over you and your families. May the Lord bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you, and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you his peace. You all make it a great day. We'll see you next time.